Hello. We're going to be looking at a few terms that have to do with the concept of evangelization. Our first term is the word evangelization itself. It's very often misunderstood. Here's what Catholics mean when we use the word evangelization: the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ through word and witness. Through word and witness. So let's break this down into a few of those words, because they're words that we aren't used to hearing. When we say proclamation, what we mean is we are giving voice and speaking once more into the world that news, that good news that God has spoken into the world through Jesus. So proclamation is individual Christians and the church as a whole speaking the story of Jesus and what he has done. The gospel we will learn more about later, but the word gospel literally means good news, the good news of Jesus Christ. So one thing about evangelization is that for it to be evangelization, it needs to be good news. So it needs to be what people hear as God's eternal, undying love for them, God's plan for happiness in this life and forever with him in the next life. uh, for evangelization to be evangelization from a Catholic perspective, it needs to be a message of hope and of love, even if sometimes that tough love calls for us to let go of some things that are not good for us, right? Jesus Christ, we know him, he has a beard, right? Okay, so Christ is the Greek word for Messiah, and Messiah is the Hebrew word for anointed one. So we're going to learn a lot about the name Messiah and the anointed one. But just to note that the gospel of Jesus Christ carries with it that all that meaning and all that importance of the word Messiah, it carries it into the definition of evangelization. And finally, word and witness. What does that mean? Well, word is pretty obvious. It means that we are able to use language to proclaim, to speak about God's saving action in the world and in our lives. That's what we use, is we use language. And witness means that other people witness the way that our lives have changed because of our encounter with the gospel, the good news. Okay, so witness refers to Christians living in the world, walking God's path for them, God's path of peace and freedom, God's path of rejoicing in God's undying love for us, and also that love that God bestows on us, even though we're not worthy. It fills us up so much that when we go out into the world and we see people who are suffering, people who need love, we can't help but show to them the same love that God has shown to us. So in other words, evangelization is necessarily tied to words and to actions. That is, people, for us to be evangelizers, we need to be walking the walk as well as talking the talk. Okay. Now, John Paul II, he spoke about this and he wrote about it, and he identified three ways in which evangelization happens. And it's just important to think of kind of the context, or the time and place where we would expect to see evangelization in a certain way. So three circumstances in which the church evangelizes. Number one, the church must reach out to cultures, communities, and groups where Christ is unknown. So this could be that they actually haven't heard the Christian story, or it could be that they haven't heard the Christian story in a way that they can accept because it's been, for example, tied to colonial violence, or it hasn't been presented in ways that are culturally relevant, or that there are other conflicting values which have opposed a gospel message of universal equality of people before God, for example. So, so there still is that evangelization impetus to go to people who have not heard and just tell the story. You know what? God lives, and he sent Jesus into the world. Jesus died, but was raised from the dead. So that's what we usually think of when we think of evangelization, but it's not the only way that evangelization happens. The second one that John Paul II noticed was that active and vibrant Christian communities, those communities need to be evangelized as well. So you could be in a church and you could go to church every Sunday, and you still need that proclamation of good news to be proclaimed to you, and you still have essentially a Christian identity that's bound up in evangelizing. So when you get together with other Christians, we are still proclaiming God's good news, and we're able to live it together. That's why Christian community is valuable, is because what has transformed our hearts, we see made alive in the community. And the way that we see it is that it strengthens us, and also we are a part of strengthening the community as well. So participating in Catholic communities, and then the other word is pastoral care. So pastoral care is simply that in local communities, someone is entrusted in taking charge of making sure that the community has what they need, that they are continually evangelized, so that they continue in hope in the good news, and they don't basically forget the message, or they don't fall into a rut, or if there are tough times in their lives, they are helped to see tough times in their lives from the perspective of the gospel. That's evangelization too. And then the last one, and John Paul II is kind of famous for pointing out this third one, and it's been about it's almost 50 years since he identified this, and we're still trying to understand it in the church today. And that is individuals or groups who have been baptized, right? They're part of the church, but no longer actively live their faith. So they don't go to church, they don't pray to God, they don't even associate themselves with the church. John Paul II said these people too need to have the good news proclaimed to them, and maybe they need to have it proclaimed to them in a new way. What we mean is the gospel is so profound and life transforming that if somebody thinks that they've seen the gospel and they just aren't interested, well, we want to make sure that they've actually seen the fullness of what Jesus offers. So that person still needs to be evangelized, right? But because that person is baptized, it's like, well, they aren't in a community, in a church community, because they've disassociated from church, and they aren't out in a culture that's never heard of Jesus. They just haven't heard of Jesus in a way that sets their hearts on fire, and that they see what is attractive and beautiful about it. Now, maybe they just don't want to be Christian, but maybe they also need to hear the news, the good news, proclaimed to them in a new way, in a way that's more connected to what they're living every day. So John Paul II called this the new evangelization, and in churchy circles, we've been working hard on this to try to imagine what is it like to try to tell somebody to tell somebody of the good news of the gospel in a way that reawakens them to it. So those are three circumstances in which the church evangelizes, which still happen under evangelization. Now, a term that's still connected to evangelization is the term inculturation. Inculturation. So this is really important to evangelization because we believe that the gospel is for every person, no matter where they come from. What we mean is that the gifts of God's love do not belong to any one culture. And what that means is when we share the gospel, we don't need to make the other person just like us in terms of culture. So from the very beginning, one thing was the difference between the Jewish culture and the Greek culture immediately following the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And the disciples of Jesus were all Jewish, and they were following Jesus, and they were talking about Jesus. And eventually, some non-Jewish people were able to listen in and hear, hey, that's kind of interesting. And as they heard more about the story of Jesus, of how he was prophesied to come, and how he came and healed and forgave sins, and how he died on the cross and rose again, they got really excited and they wanted to become Christians. So they had a big question in their mind, and that is, okay, well, we want to follow Jesus. Does that mean we need to give up being Greek in order to become Jewish? And the church, the earliest church, these are the people who laid eyes on Jesus, and they don't know because Jesus didn't tell them whether or not Greeks were allowed to follow him even if they weren't Jewish, right? And they prayed about it. The church prayed about it, and they came we believe that the Spirit spoke in their hearts, and the Spirit said, you know what? Um, the gospel is for everybody, and people don't need to follow a certain cultural practice in order to receive God's love in Jesus. So they went back to the Greeks and they said, you know what? There are a few things that are important that are a part of your culture that you need to leave behind. And so there are things like having sex outside of marriage and worshiping idols. And they said, you know, those are things about Jewish culture that really do carry over with Jesus. But you do not need to become Jewish. You can continue to be Greek. And for that matter, because the Roman Empire had many, many cultures within it, you could continue to be Ethiopian. You could continue to be Armenian. You could continue to be Gaulish or Macedonian. You can continue your cultures, and your cultures have elements of goodness in them. And you can be Christian, and you can receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is the Spirit of Christ, even though you're from a different culture. So when we see this example between Jewish and Greek, we see the definition of enculturation. The definition of enculturation is a respectful encounter between the Christian faith and a particular culture. Okay, so what's really important to remember about this is that Catholicism especially explicitly says that you don't need to have any particular culture in order to follow Jesus. There are some elements of all cultures that don't fit with Christian life, but that doesn't mean that you all need to become European, for example. You don't need to wear European clothes, follow European economics, all these other things that unfortunately in the colonial period, the teaching kind of was not received by many Catholics who were going around the world, right? So I think we know what enculturation is as a term when there's something that we're excited about and we share it with somebody who has no idea about it, right? And so if you're a big fan of a music group and you share, and you're like, this band is awesome, here, I'll call up the song and I play it, and somebody else, you know what, they hate country music, but they listen to the song and they're like, oh, that's a pretty cool song. Thanks for sharing that, right? That's not gospel enculturation, but that's culture. That's musical enculturation, right? So you're sharing something that's a part of your culture in a respectful way. Now, we also know that sometimes there's aspects of culture, whether it's ideology or maybe it's music fandom, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, this person is the best music artist ever. You have to listen. You have to become a fan. Well, we know what that's like when somebody's pushing their cultural preferences on us, and we have another word for that. But in terms of a respectful encounter, just sharing what belongs to us and what's been given to us in a respectful way so that other people can enjoy it, that's how Christianity, that's how Catholic Christianity sees us sharing the gospel message, that the gospel message is the most important thing in our lives, and so we share it respectfully, and we don't hold it back just because somebody speaks a different language, wears different clothes, or has, you know, different physical characteristics. We don't withhold it from people based on cultural difference. So we're ready to share that respectfully. Sometimes Christians, like all humans, have not done this. We've kind of done. In order for enculturation to be respectful, it needs to be a back and forth. It needs to be a two-way process. So in terms of the church and another culture, what happens in enculturation is actually the values of the culture come into the life of the church. Okay, so the values of the culture come into the life of the church. So one obvious example is the way that Western Europeans celebrate Christmas. Lots of people know that the Christmas tree wasn't originally a Christian symbol. And the idea of Christmas being a really kind of cold and dark moment in the natural year, I mean, that only works in the Northern Hemisphere. So the people in Western Europe and Northern Europe, they had certain rituals and they had certain cultural values about gathering together, about being generous with what they had, because it was the middle of winter is a hostile environment, and they had this tree that was sacred to them. And they took all those things, and when they became Christian, they said, you know, we're going to continue some of these things that are really important to our culture, the importance of gathering together, the importance of light in the darkness, and the importance of being generous with what we have. Well, you know that Northern Africa doesn't have the same kind of December 25th. You know that in Australia and South Africa and South America, they don't have the same liturgical season. So they wouldn't have brought those cultural values into Christmas. It's just that at a certain particular point of history, that's when Christianity encountered the Northern European peoples, and that's how the church was actually affected by the culture that was already there. Now, the other side of the two-way process is that the church proclaims the gospel message in different cultural contexts, and it allows the faith to take flesh in each people's culture. What does that mean? Well, one of the things is Christ doesn't come to save giraffes. Christ comes to save humans. And one part of humanity is culture. Culture is the values and the practices that we do together to live well, to walk well in the world together. And what the church sees in the process of enculturation is that the gospel enters into these cultures so that the church enters into these cultures so that they can live out what Jesus wants. They can live out the life and the promise and the hope of Christianity, and they can do so in their own cultural practices. Whatever does not contradict the gospel is welcome to become a part of the Christian's identity. And so, this happens in many ways. One of the examples that we looked at in class was the example of Black Elk. So Black Elk practiced Lakota traditions, and when he was baptized, he began to see how Christianity could become interwoven with his Lakota traditions, including praying with the pipe and including other ceremonies. He would pray and practice these ceremonies while he would participate in Christian devotions such as the Rosary and celebrating the Mass. So Black Elk is kind of a really good example of enculturation, where the respectful exchange of culture and faith was able to find fruit and find life and really impact people in a positive way, both within what had been the church and now with the growing church of Lakota people that he educated about Christianity. They could freely accept Christianity and have it become a part of their older Lakota traditions. What's the opposite of enculturation? That's the next slide. The opposite of enculturation is a word called proselytism. Proselytism. It's a mouthful to say. And I think we have all had an encounter with something like proselytism. Proselytism is the aggressive seeking of converts to one's own religious faith, and often it's to pull them away from another spirituality or another religious practice. Now, I think we've all encountered this when somebody has just been too pushy, right? And so this could be when you go into a store and the salesperson is quite pushy. It could be in a religious context where somebody starts to talk to you about their religion and they won't go away. They're very aggressive in it. And we do know that there are examples of Catholics engaging in proselytism. And the example that we talk about in class is the Catholic participation in, and other Christian churches' participation in the Canadian government's residential school system. While there are examples of Catholics engaging in proselytism, one thing that's important to know is that Catholics are instructed that proselytism is not acceptable. Catholics are instructed, it is a part of solemn church teaching, that proselytism is not acceptable, because we believe that every individual person is born with the freedom to accept the gospel or reject the gospel. And anything that manipulates or forces that freedom is not of the gospel. Okay, so when some Catholics do engage in proselytism, they have been told not to, and they are not in keeping with Catholic teaching. An example of this is the idea of aid for people who are in need. So right now, the Catholic Church is one of the largest charity organizations, and we go to places that are in need. So let's say a typhoon has wiped out a country that's still developing, and they still don't have a lot of infrastructure or a lot of wealth to kind of recover from the typhoon. The Catholic ethos, the way that Catholics are instructed to go into a situation like that, to bring aid, is to bring aid no matter what. If you are poor, if your home has been swept away, if you are hungry, if you're in danger of contracting an illness, Catholics will give you the physical, medical help that you need. We'll provide food, we'll provide shelter, we'll provide rebuilding. End of story, no questions asked. What we have seen in other groups and also other Christian groups is that sometimes receiving aid in a disaster situation is tied to coming to church. So they will feed you, but first there will be a prayer service where they share a Bible message with you. Now the rationale for that.
Any teachers that have a period 5, if you could come to the main office to pick up your report card.
Now, the rationale for withholding food until you have a Bible story is that to those Christians, the Bible is more important to them than food, and so they want to offer what is better, spiritual nourishment before material nourishment. But the Catholic Church interprets it differently. The Catholic Church says, to the person being served, physical food, satisfying their material hunger, is more important to that person. If that person, after you feed them, asks, why are you doing this for me? You can tell them, because Jesus told me to, because Jesus loves you, and so do I. You can begin a conversation of Christianity, but you don't hold it back and say, you know what, until you listen to my message, I'm not going to give you food. The Catholic Church sees that as a manipulation and as taking advantage of somebody in order to essentially push our religious viewpoint on someone who doesn't really have the freedom to accept the gospel because they haven't really received what they need, and that is food for their hunger, right? So that would be an example of where Catholicism has chosen not to follow the path of proselytism, and even still today, some groups still do that. So while you and I both know examples of proselytism, such as the residential school system in Canada, it's important to recognize that the church teaches that everyone should have the freedom to choose their own faith tradition, and that would include the freedom of parents to choose how their children are raised in a religious tradition. And I think I'm not the only one who would observe the residential school system and see that that teaching was largely not followed in the participation of the Canadian government's program. So there are three terms